And hello, everyone. Good morning here from central Victoria on the east coast of Australia. It's also to welcome to our very first live of Australians for a New Democracy, the first think tank, educational piece, etc. And obviously, too, I'd like to also acknowledge, well, I'm actually broadcasting from the land of the Dja Dja Wurrung, but I also acknowledge all the others are on different nations as well. And I'd like to acknowledge all the people of past and elders past, present, and future, and also acknowledge that their struggle was originally a struggle against invasion and colonialism through now to a much broader struggle, which actually needs to which I won't say need to, but will eventually be a big, broader struggle against imperialism and much unity, much broader for our own pre-independent country. Now, also too, today we've got Nate, Jay, and Joe. All welcome. How are you all doing today?
Yeah, good, Dave. How are you, mate?
Doing great.
Doing
Good,
well.
good.
Thank you for having me.
And looking forward to this event.
Yes. Well, for those of you who will be watching later on and obviously maybe listening in now, I'll just note that it is the 26th of January down here, which currently is a very controversial date amongst a lot of people, especially the First Nations, in relation to being our national holiday. And there's obviously been many fights over the years over this particular date. And obviously, because well, rightfully so to a certain degree. It's 26th of January in 1788. The first fleet came through Sydney Heads and established the penal colony of New South Wales at the time. And obviously, through this time, it's always been a point of contention and debate. And obviously, for our strong beliefs too, we believe that it wasn't when the nation was formed. And for some history there, for those of you, actually, we federated as a nation on the 1st of January 1901. So, really, pretty much that should technically or officially be our national day. However, in the late 1980s, Bob Hawke, he was Prime Minister, to acknowledge that as the national day, and then the 1990s, it was ratified as such to become a national holiday. And with the current struggles that were behind it, that came behind it, especially from the First Nations people, it actually originally started out as a major struggle for land rights, land reform, but unfortunately, it has been diluted into just a informal or just a small little gesture or token gesture of change the date and also basically to indulge in self-flagellation and guilt. And I think it really needs to be ramped up again. Basically, and this is what the discussion's about, what it means to us, and moving forward as well, and also to acknowledge that it is a sensitive issue amongst First Nations people, so just be aware of that. So I just want to open up and to Jay first. Want just any comments on that?
Yeah, I fully agree with what you've said so far. I mean, the problem that we've seen in Australia is that we've seen the watering down of a lot of Aboriginal demands. So if we look at what Aboriginal activists were arguing for in the 1960s and 70s, they were arguing for land rights, and they had a major victory, after the 1972 Aboriginal embassy protest in Canberra, because that brought an end to the idea that Aboriginal people should simply be assimilated into the Australian mainstream. It was recognised that Aboriginal people constitute a nation, or at least a nation of nations, because that's the concept of pan-Aboriginality. And so what we've seen is that the demand for land rights, of the kind that they have in the Northern Territory, which is the 1976 Land Rights Act, it's been watered down into native title. And to quote Gary Foley, this is the most inferior form of land tenure under British law. And he's gone on the record to state that it should not be equated with land rights. And so I think it's important to recognize what's happened, which is that the demand for land rights has eventually kind of morphed into this demand to change the date. The idea is that the date itself, the 26th of January, is offensive to Aboriginal people, and therefore we have to change it. But that wasn't what Aboriginal activists were arguing for in the 1960s and 70s. They were arguing for land rights and a treaty, those two very important things. And I would add to that by saying that, we got to think about things that are more innovative. So one of the things that I've been thinking about is what if if Aboriginal people constitute a nation within Australia, then maybe they should be entitled to a certain percentage of the money supply, like so they can have their own kind of monetary autonomy. So instead of talking about solutions, unfortunately, we tend towards culture wars, and that's been a tendency, throughout the past few decades. Yeah.
Yeah, if no one else, if I may jump in
Yeah,
here,
Joe.
I think it's, I think that's right. We've got to get back to it, and we've got to get back to the national question of Australia, which is one part is the First Nations, and we can't move forward as a society until that's been resolved. And I think Jay has said really the direction that Australia as a whole needs to go. But it's also related to the national question of society, Australian society as a whole, which is both Indigenous people and non-Indigenous people. Unless we pursue both of them, we go ahead with neither. And if we go back to the time after the First Fleet, I mean, this place was settled not so much by a bunch of colonists. It was settled by a few of them, but mostly with people brought over here in chains and then used as slaves who actually had no authority. And that pattern of these two sections of the arriving white society continued and continues to this day. And there has been an internal battle within non-Indigenous society as well, which reached its height at the Eureka Rebellion, 1856. It didn't come out of nowhere. There was an intense class struggle. The landed gentry, who we might call the squattocracy, were dominating government. They were dominating the police. They were dominating everything, the law, and so on, imposing taxes on the miners. And there are other things going on. People jacked up on it eventually. And that was a sentiment, and that was a movement, a global movement against the old order. And people rose in Eureka. It wasn't only in Ballarat. I mean, certainly we've all heard about the Eureka Stockade and, the events around it. But there was a movement through Victoria, around Australia, that actually demanded major change to Australian society. And we have two things that emerged out of that. One of them is republicanism. Another one is the idea of multiculturalism, where people from all sorts of places who come together to form a new society, a new culture. And there was also the idea of democracy, not European democracy, but democracy of a new kind. And in that sense, Australia did progress to a certain extent. But what we're faced with now is that it's an incomplete change. There is much further we still need to go. And a lot of the problems of today can be reflected back to that.
It certainly can. And I mean, obviously, too, although I've heard us saying the past doesn't have to dictate the present and the future, but it certainly is connected to such, and there's quite a long history to there. And obviously, our struggles, it's definitely unfinished as yet, because basically when we did federate as a nation in 1901, it was actually agreed to after a lot of campaigning, etc. But the British Parliament, they acknowledged the Commonwealth of Australia, and there was obviously certain powers granted to the Commonwealth government, and obviously ones to the state. And basically, what it was to administer British capital on a much more even playing field. Where beforehand, when it was all 6 colonies, there were tariffs put on goods travelling between states, regardless if they imported or exported. You had across the border, you had to pay tariffs. There was all those fun and games, and no actual free flowing of the British policy of free trade as such. So that was basically what it came down to. And for Australia's sovereignty, for a long time, we still had to ask permission from the British Parliament or the Privy Council and the Crown, for example, to start our own steel industry. Was a classic example. World War I exposes for what it was. But all our armed forces, everything else was still dictated to by basically the British Crown. And that's something that's still its unfinished business. Jay, did you want to talk a little bit more on that, and then I'll go over to Nate.
Me? Yeah, sure. Or Jay or Joe. That's the thing. Oh, you're on mute.
Jay, sorry.
Yeah, right. Yeah, absolutely. I mean, the problem is that, like, Australia's attempts to become like an independent nation have always been stifled, and in many ways, Australian nationalism, like to the extent that, like, the dominant hegemonic forms of Australian nationalism have always been about tying Australia first to Britain and then to now the United States. So like that's what Australian monarchism is about. It's completely empty of substance. It's simply about subservience to a foreign head of state. So I agree with people who say that Australia hasn't had, like, if we talk about the unfinished bourgeois revolution, I tend to agree. I mean, in the sense that Australia's never actually had a successful overthrow of the state and then reconstituting the state on a new basis. I mean, America has had that twice, like 1776 when they threw out the British, 1865 the Civil War. But in Australia, I mean, as inspirational as the Eureka Rebellion was, it didn't actually overthrow the state and then create a revolution in that sense. And so, in order to tame the spirit of Eureka, like a kind of a new type of Australian nationalism, or really, it's not really new at all. Sorry, I should say that again. The type of Australian nationalism that's been promoted has been one that's extremely Anglo and centered around, like, this British identity. And so Australians themselves can't think of Australia as an independent country, which is why we're so fascinated with American politics. It's like a lot of Australians follow American politics and act as if what's happening over there in the United States is relevant to us here. So that's like the kind of psychological kind of mindset that a lot of Australians are in.
Yeah, I think it is relevant.
I agree with what you're saying, Joe.
Yeah.
I was going to say that just adding on to that, we can see the evidence of just how latent this acceptance of ruling foreign powers are over our head of state. Even just average Australians who don't seem to be politically inclined at all will follow American politics much more closely than they do Australian politics. And to a certain extent, obviously it does affect us because the US is the premier imperial power in the world. So of course it does have ramifications for us here. But they don't follow it because of that. They follow American politics. If you ask them, their reasoning is that, it's more entertaining, or it's more there's more action, or there's more turmoil, things like that. Sort of as if it's like a spectator sport, right? Yeah. So it's like moving on is that we can also see evidence of how subservient we are to foreign powers when you have a look at probably one of the only leaders that we've ever had in history, Gough Whitlam, who wasn't a revolutionary, mind you, but he was just a little bit less amenable to the wishes of the US at the time, in which he expressed wishes to withdraw Australian security forces, for intelligence forces from Chile, before the coup of Allende. And he was subsequently subject to a parliamentary coup by the CIA. So it was even just the most tacit admission that we want some kind of independence for Australia. We don't want to have American foreign interference in our country. Results in our own leader being couped and replaced with someone who's more amenable to US interests.
Yeah, I think a big part of the problem is that the biggest part is that, in effect, we have an elite ruling class, a group of people who control the organs of power in this country. And they're closely linked right from the beginning, right from the first fleet. The jailers were administrating for the British authorities. Governments since then, even since Federation, were in effect. I mean, Federation was an act of the British Parliament. We have media in Australia, 80% controlled by Rupert Murdoch's organisation, I should say, an American media network in reality. So people don't get any other source of information. There's been a huge American cultural invasion over the last few decades in particular. So, of course, Australian society is influenced by it, but also within that, there's also rejection of it. And one of the big problems with this idea, the sort of Anglo sort of view of Australia, is that most people living in Australia don't themselves have that heritage now. Most people living in Australia, most people being born in Australia or who migrated here, have other heritages. So it's having less and less of a hold. Our problem and the problem of Australia is we need to forge a new identity. We need to be looking forwards and have an understanding where we need to go.
Can I just add to that by saying that if you look at Australia from the perspective of Britain, we're a giant resource-rich continent. That's the way they see us. That's the way the United States sees us. The Gough Whitlam dismissal, a major part of that was because he wanted to nationalize the mining wealth of Australia. But now, if you look at like the mines, like 80% of the profits go overseas, primarily to US investors. And Kevin Rudd, when he tried to impose a tax on mining, you know, the super profits tax, he was gotten rid of as well. And that was also something. I mean, it wasn't as blatant in the sense that it wasn't like a dismissal. It was an internal party coup by from within the Labor Party to get rid of him. So in many ways, like Australia is a first world country. Why? Because we are a relatively small population sitting on top of a very large mountain of natural resources. But if you look at the export composition that we churn out, we're like a third world country. And I think in many ways, the United States and Britain would like to keep Australia that way because from their point of view, a country like Australia allows countries like China and Japan and all of these other more industrial countries to have faith in the US dollar and in the Anglo American financial system because they see Australia as a vassal that's willing to sell resources to them. On commodities markets that are denominated in US dollars. So this is the problem, you know. It's like ultimately, I think what we should be advocating for is, aside from the national question, which I believe should be resolved in favor of Aboriginal people having a treaty and land rights, but also the national question should also extend to resources. And that's why I think that the primary demand in Australia should be about nationalising the banks and mines. I mean, you start off with an extreme slogan like that, and you may end up with one national bank and a profit tax or something like that. But in any case, it's better than what we have now. And the idea is that people resonate with this stuff, regardless of what they think about the national question with regards to Aboriginal people. If you say to them Australia's deindustrialized, the Holden factories have closed down, you're not going to see police cars nowadays. They drive Audis. They don't drive Holdens anymore, which is very strange for me, having grown up. They were always Holdens, right? And then now to see them as Audis and BMWs, it's very, very strange. And so, yeah, I mean, this idea that, we're a deindustrializing country when we don't need to be. I mean, think about it this way. The reason India deindustrialized is because a foreign state basically ended up gaining control over taxation and then used that to drain the wealth out of India. And then India deindustrialized and became a primary commodity exporter. Australia is deindustrializing without having foreign military powers directly controlling us, directly shooting us and suppressing us. They control us because of the English language and by making us think that their interests are the same as our interests. So in many ways, we're kind of culturally colonized by the fact that we speak English.
Yeah, I think on that it sort of brings us up to a point, and I think it's an even bigger question is that sense of who we are and where we're going, and the question of democracy that began really from the First Fleet, continued during Eureka and still on today, is what does that mean? And I'd just like to just very briefly mention that the concept of democracy that's bandied about at the moment came out of the Enlightenment, the time of upheaval in Europe, the end of the feudal era, the early strivings in part towards capitalism, but something that began in the rebellion of peoples. You had places, the Peasant Wars, Germany, Holland, and other places in Europe. You had the English Revolution, the mid 1600s. You had the Leveller movement in the UK. You had the American War of Independence, and this continuous upheaval until the French Revolution. And with that, the thought that came out of that is the idea of the separation of powers, between the executive, the parliament, and the judiciary. But there was also more than that, because within this movement that had gone on for 200 years, the first stirrings of something different, the beginnings of the idea of socialism were starting to emerge. And a lot of people don't know the red flag, the Internationale, were symbols of the French Revolution. That's when they actually came into existence. So the kernel of what was coming started there. Now, one thing that was left out of this concept of the separation of these three powers is that the armed forces of the state, the military, the police, are actually centers of power as well. It's very strange that they still get left out, given that the history of coups against governments, it actually proves in itself that the military has political power. So, but it is denied. With the rise of the printing press, it was found, and people started calling the media the fourth estate. That actually means it's another center of political power. The problem is, and the experience has been since the end of the Napoleonic Wars in particular, where the so-called democratic systems really came into their own through the 19th and the 20th century, is that these powers that were supposed to be checks and balances were actually dominated by the same group of people and actually worked together in one direction. An elite of society, elite, and the captains of industry, politicians, and senior functionaries moved in the same circles, worked together. In effect, what it did is solidified class rule. What was left out was actually what brought change in the first place, and that was the organization and action of the masses. So when we're talking about democracy, we must recognize that these four powers we're talking about, and I'd add academia into the media because they're both involved in the manufacture of ideology, that they work together, and there's a facade that they don't. But generally, they do work together, except when there's some internal divisions and, and so on. But for us, they're all important because we need to fight in these arenas to actually pull the decision-making power downwards. But we also need to be talking about this thing that changed, this action of the masses, people's power. We need to be talking about the rise of a new form of power, and that means a new form of democracy. And I think that a good term for that is new democracy. New democracy actually means that we actually challenge those who are controlling the centers of power at the moment. And we do that through battling within these centers of power, but most importantly, by developing a new center of power that rests in the hands of working people.
Yeah, or in other words, a participatory democracy, in which the workers and the masses of people directly participate in the decisions of the institutions.
And I'd say it's not a brand new idea. When Karl Marx wrote of the experience of the Paris Commune, for instance, which was the first recognized socialist revolution as such, that this was one of the failings or a major failing of it. And he talked about the need to create a state of a new kind. And that's what this is a state of a new kind is really, and what he talked about, and he wasn't the first one, other people talked about, is a state where ordinary people actually have the power to collectively make the decisions and to collectively implement them.
Yeah. Can I just also add to, just I mean to throw the argument back completely, but change the subject also to acknowledge that history for us didn't start in 1788. Australia actually had a history well before them too. One of the oldest continents on the ancient continents on this earth. I mean, humans have been here for God knows 60, 80,000 years. I don't know the actual time estimate, but obviously we've got the world's oldest culture, and I think blowing it into this discussion we're having now, it's also to understand it's how our powers to be kept us all divided, wanted to subject the first people, the First Nations, as such a way. I mean, I heard this classic line from Chicano one time that racism is really national oppression. And so what I'm seeing is the system we're under as well actually oppresses other peoples, and especially the First Nations, but they'll find other groups to do so. So in a sense, when we're talking about freedom and democracy, or democracy, and that, when I've heard all the language across on the media that we're all inclusive, we're a tolerant nature, and that's really, no, it's not, because underneath there's just this lying, there's all this cesspool of insidious stuff that's been happening for many, many years. And also to realise that the struggle here is obviously too moving forward is to not just acknowledge it, but I think we really need to sort of bring that and struggle up right at the forefront of some of the listed demands, because as we started out, it started off out as land rights for land reform, and now it's obviously moved into such a obviously needs to move into such a bigger way, because bigger demands as well, such as sovereignty, etc. But one thing I learned actually in school, and this is interesting, it's how we were such a free democratic nation, and the Queen's all good, and basically we were supposed to be the jewel in the crown of the whole entire world, but as history really shows, it's not that at all. And obviously, 40 years of neoliberal policies have certainly ripped that right up wide open, and you can just see the major inequality we have in Australia, both by income, etc. But and obviously too, COVID, that's certainly exposed it for what it is. And now we're in a situation where it's nearly every man for himself, or sorry, every person for themselves. And this is where it's like a disaster waiting the whole imperialist capitalist system. It was due to happen sooner or later. Sorry, over to your comments.
Can I just add to that when we talk about democracy of a new kind, grassroots democracy and things like that, I mean, we agree. I mean, these are all kind of now nice sounding phrases, but to add something a little bit more concrete is the struggle over the internet. It's like I mean, we ourselves, I mean, we're dependent on this online platform to get our message out, and big tech censorship is a huge threat. Because I think if we look back at the period up until 2016, 2017, that will be remembered as the period in which the internet, Facebook, Twitter, YouTube, these platforms were all relatively free. You could say what you wanted. The algorithms weren't too discriminatory. But like recently I was reading an article by Caitlin Johnston. Censorship by algorithm does far more damage than conventional censorship. And, she goes over what people have experienced, so Jonathan Cook, he's talking, he's a writer. I mean, he covers mainly the Middle East, but he says that as the algorithms tightened, I mean, the amount of shares that he got for his articles, it went from thousands to the hundreds. I mean, me, myself, I've been kicked off Facebook. I had a following of 3,000 people. So this is where I think a demand for a new democracy should be, I think, a demand for a national social media platform that is an extension of Australian democracy. So take, for example, just imagine you've got a politician, they've got a something like a social media platform. Because they're a politician, they don't have the right to block people. That would be one thing that I would add. It would also be that, if a person has a number of beyond a certain number of likes for the question that they're asking, then, you know, the politician has to answer it. And based on how they respond, you know, they can actually be ranked down, you know, like those kinds of possibilities are all like, they're all there, you know, like they're all technologically feasible now. So I think the struggle over big tech is absolutely huge, because how can you can't really have like a democracy if your elected politicians can be censored by some nerd in Silicon Valley who lives in the United States. So it's a question of national sovereignty. You know, I mean, we used to laugh at the Chinese, like, you know, back like 15 years ago. I mean, not me. I mean, I didn't know enough about it back then, right? But a lot of people did. They say China has this like great firewall and they're suppressing free speech and they're suppressing the internet. But look what they've done. They've managed to close themselves off. And as a result, they've managed to limit the penetration of their online space by the CIA and the NSA. Whereas our online space is completely controlled by them, as well as like a handful of, you know, private lobbying groups as well. So that's like a huge problem, you know, the fact that our elected politicians can be kicked off and deplatformed, even though we elected them, because they rely on these private platforms, is a problem. We need an Australian government-run Facebook that functions as an extension of democracy. Now, of course, that comes with all kinds of problems, because then the issue is, well, what if the government censors you? Which is why I think like the next kind of Bill of Rights movement should be about what you're allowed to say on that platform. You know, like what kinds of speech are acceptable, what's not acceptable. So, for example, on Twitter, you know, up until very recently, you could post pornography and that was fine. But I know a personal friend of mine, his name's Laith Maroof, and, you know, he was kicked off and he's shadow banned as well. And that's because on Twitter, there's been this ongoing campaign of ethnic cleansing against Palestinian accounts. You know, so this is a huge issue. Like, I think every single country in the world, if they want to protect their sovereignty, they need to create their own online social media platform. I feel very strongly about this, so I thought I'd bring it up.
Yeah, I agree, Jay. I think also just to a broader point is that in the 21st century, the social media space is the town square. It's the new town square where people go to meet, exchange ideas, you know, and socialize. So it just comes down to the question of who owns that town square, right? Now, traditionally, physical town squares were owned by the principalities, the cities, the sovereignty, right? Now, these days, they're owned by privately owned corporations for profit. So it's just this is an entirely new dynamic now, where we have the biggest gatherings of people are online now, right? I mean, you've got Facebook, which has billions of people as an audience, but the thing is that the algorithms that Facebook has, and all these other tech companies like Google and YouTube, Twitter, and all that, they're controlled for their own political gain, which at the end of the day is profit and is solidification of their power. So we need to take that back. And like you said, Jay, this is something that needs to happen on a government level. This needs to happen as an extension to already existing social media companies, but also to keep our own politicians in check as well. And it's really interesting you mentioned China there, because the position that China is in now with their Great Firewall is that they've managed to achieve that. They've managed to move their town squares to online spaces where politicians can be grilled online publicly, right? Their politicians can be grilled. They can't censor the people that are grilling them. There's even, as a further extension to that, the local governments there also put polls, officially held polls online on these social media sites about what people would like to see happen in their cities and towns. Now, the results of these polls are often then held officially, and they have to move on it. They have to actually do something on it. So can you imagine, as Australians, if your local council or say the state government put out a poll on a government-owned social media site saying, "Oh, how would you like us to administer the park near your area?" Or what are your wishes to do with the garbage collection? Or, you know, like things that have to do with your life, things that are relevant to you as an Australian living in the area that you do. The potential there is amazing. We just haven't even considered it, let alone utilized it.
That's right. I just sort of throw that too. I mean, it's social media, just how there's, especially in the last few years, and how they've been, obviously, what happened with Capitol Hill in Washington on January the 6th last year, how they went on, basically ramped up an exercise to censor a lot of people and kick people off groups. I mean, I'm not talking about people just put obnoxious stuff, horrible stuff up there, but I mean, but anyone that might have a differing opinion about the powers that be. And I noticed, yeah, Jay's been hammering over that, and obviously a lot of other people talking about what I'm actually noticing is a lot of censoring of comments, especially over what's happening with the Ukraine at the moment. And also too, playing criticising US foreign power. It's certainly we've got every right to do so because we're caught up right into it. But all of a sudden, the media, what I've noticed, the general mainstream media, it talk about this being typical, wanted to emphasise the fact that the Prime Minister's WeChat account was shut down or taken over, and blaming the Chinese government for it. Actually, I found it quite funny, really. It really couldn't happen to a better prize bastard. But at the end of the day, it just, and I had no sympathy
Surprised you
whatsoever.
use WeChat.
Yeah, which I'm actually surprised he did in the first. But it wasn't at the Chinese government either. I think it was a Chinese businessman saw the opportunity to take it over because he had a bigger audience to branch out and make more money. That's all it came down to.
Ironically, he bought it, right, using the free market.
Yeah. So
yeah.
Actually, there you go. Hang on, Joe. Before you go, there you go, Prime Minister Scott Morrison. There you go. You're all for the free market and all that. Well, your WeChat channel has now been freed for the free market. It's been taken over.
Yeah.
Sorry, Joe.
Yeah, just a few comments on what's been said so far. I think at the beginning, I mean, with the First Nations people before, in their traditional society, particularly before the First Fleet, that they actually practiced a society and a way of organising a political power where they didn't have a small strata standing above them and running everything. So, it was a collective society where people were more or less pretty equal. So there's a lot we can learn from there. But I think there are also some other issues which we must look at. And while, the internet has been mentioned and what's been said is perfectly true, 100% with that. But there's also a bigger question. Without a democratic media, there's no democracy. And we need to do that. We need to be looking also at print media because we need to have access to the voice of the population. And that means that we must do something about the monopoly of media by a few corporations. We need to have an alternative media, large-scale media. The internet is part of it, but print media is also part of it. And this gets us to the point. And what Nate said about, local councils, for instance, the using the internet. Well, there are other forms we can use, and the internet is certainly one avenue. But I think we need to be not only talking about nice ideas, as wonderful as they might be. We need to be talking, how do we start getting there? We need to be talking about the practicalities themselves. And Nate really opened up on that because we need to be talking, one of the areas is democracy starts locally. And we need to be talking about how can we use the thing to get people at the local level together, because it'd be easier to have an influence on local government, but extending from that, how can local communities manage their own affairs? We need to be talking about workplaces. We need to be saying, look, it shouldn't be only the boss who makes the decisions. There should be a mechanism where those who work and are actually affected by the workplace should have a voice on the decisions that are made in the workplace, who gets the share of what out of it, who gets employed, et cetera, et cetera. Communities have a role in that too, because if a workplace affects a local community, talk about the environment, for instance, talk about products that might go out into their communities. They should have a voice there. So we're talking about a new types of organisation as well, not only ideas. We should be talking about setting up councils of people. I'm not talking about the local councils of form of government, but something much wider. Assemblies where people can come together, discuss things, make decisions that are binding, and actually have a role in putting them into effect. We should be talking about new types of collective organisation that improve the environment, amenities in the area, but also create jobs that people can manage. Create an economy that people have an authority. And that's one thing that hasn't been mentioned yet today, because another centre of political power, although it's not formal, is who controls the economy. So we need to be looking into that as well. So there are lots of things that can be done. This can begin now. It's a long process, and I think it needs to start at the first step. But we need to start creating situations where people can get together and talk about what they can do. And I'll tell you what, it is no secret that capitalism, we're talking about it as a global system, United States, imperialism, the system operating in Australia is in crisis. And it's not going to get better. The gap between those who have and those who haven't is getting wider. And people are losing faith in it. They're starting to. They haven't found a solution as yet. But the system is less and less able to operate. It's not going to get better once COVID has ended. So we need to be talking about, not widely as a society, what do we need to do right now? What do we need to start doing to start moving to a better future?
That's an excellent question, and I think that's going to be the main discussion where we move forward from here. Because as I've noticed throughout a lot of the years, a lot of movements, and that yes, they're addressing one issue or multiple issues, but moving forward, the demands have not been really strong, or it just doesn't seem to go where, because there's no actual concrete plan in place how they're going to achieve it. If they don't achieve it, what they're going to do next. That was actually an interesting question that was posed to me many years ago, and I like to pose it to everything. If our demands are not met, then what do we do? And it goes from everything from a union struggle right through to some sort of political struggle or over a particular issue, whatever it is. If our demands are not met, then what are we going to do? And that's obviously a very vital part for us for a long time. I mean, I know in other countries, France, they'll just pull out the whole population, they go on strike. Many other countries struggle in other ways and are quite impressive as well. And they do achieve a lot of their demands. But here in this country, you seem to go, oh, okay, well, another met, or just fizzles out. It gets nowhere, and everyone just feels disillusioned and disgruntled even further. And I think it's a proper concrete thing, but everyone needs to discuss, not just us four here, to come up with a solution, but everyone needs to be involved in this discussion. It's a very public question. We'll put through to everybody, because we know we're not in a very good spot. COVID certainly exposed it. We're heading there anyway, and obviously, regardless of what your position on COVID and vaccines and mandates, etc., is, we're all got to acknowledge that we're all in this together. But moving forward, what do we do? Because I know for a fact is, you've got two sides. I know that it sounds like there's two sides, but I think there's many questions to be raised. I mean, when people talk about freedom, well, they talk about freedom from whom? Freedom from which class? Freedom to do what? Because we can argue about freedom, but how can we have freedom when we're still going to be facing unemployment? We're 2 paychecks off from losing our house, or we're into destitution and poverty. There's no job security whatsoever. So basically, the future is unknown for a lot of common people. And I think it's that's a fundamental question. Well, it's obviously then has to look to the what's primary? Is it economic or is it everything else? And I believe it's economic. That's where it all stems from in the first place. I did have someone talk to someone 2 weeks ago in relation to all the rallies about the anti-mandate, anti-vax and stuff. And I asked her, what are you actually trying to achieve here? Because, I mean, even people that took the jab, it's only because they were not in a financial position to refuse. They had to keep their jobs and keep moving forward. So, it's been unfair for those trying to accuse other people and all these other things as well. It's if you're not in a financial situation where you can actually live comfortably out of the system, well, I'm sorry to say, but yeah, it's just not going to work. We're not getting it, and I've always been a big firm believer it's a system that needs to change. We could do more, as an old comrade in a mental mindset once you have to do more than change a government. You have to change the system, and so I'm going to open that up to others. Jay, do you want to kick off first, or Nate?
Yeah, I wanted to say something. One is to do with this kind of ramping up of tensions with China, which I think is very important for Australians to get their heads around. The other thing is about like going back to the big tech censorship. So just starting with the big tech censorship. Right now, the current government is trying to introduce a raft of legislation, and people like some people are kind of under the impression that the Australian government is taking on big tech. But they're not. What they're saying is that, we want big tech to give us the names of people who, may be trolling online, and they're hiding behind, what if there's like a teenage girl who's bullied online or something, and then we want to be able to unmask those bullies and prosecute them, and a lot of people are going to get behind that, but if you watch that recent video by Friendly Jordies, it quickly becomes apparent that what they're trying to do is protect politicians. So politicians, they face, social media backlash from people like Friendly Jordies, and they want to have the power to tell big tech to censor these people by treating them as publishers. And so that's what the debate is now about. It's about whether these social media platforms are publishers or platforms, right? Now, we want them to be platforms because if they're platforms, then we can argue that they have to provide equal carriage of service. So if you take, for example, your phone company can't, or they just won't typically, ban you from using their service because you said something, over a phone call, that they don't like or they deem to be problematic or whatever, or politically incorrect. They don't do that. It's just not typical of them. So similarly, why not demand that Facebook provide equal carriage of service to everyone? So we want these social media platforms to be treated as platforms, not as publishers, which is the road that we're currently going down with this government. The other thing that I wanted to talk about is China, because in many ways, I don't think Australians realize the extent to which the demonization of China is against their interests. Because if you part of demonizing China is the myth of Western exceptionalism. It's this idea that the West is better than every other country in the world. But then if you actually believe that, then you're not likely to see the flaws in your own system and see the problems and see the historical trajectory that your country is going down. You're not going to be able to see the degeneration or the decline at all if you are deluded into thinking that your country is the best in the world. And so demonizing China as this authoritarian, communist, oriental despotism is very, very, very much necessary for upholding the dominant ideology in Australia, because it prevents Australians from looking at China, seeing how the Chinese government is able to discipline its own capitalist class and its own landlords in the interest of broader economic objectives, utilitarian goals, like a meritocratic kind of distribution of wealth. Because you have to remember that China has far fewer resources than Australia does on a per capita basis. I mean, here in Australia, the per capita resource wealth is something like $600,000 per person. In China, it's something like $16,000 per person. And yet, despite having like a small amount of resources relative to Australia, they've managed to give their citizens rising living standards. Whereas in Australia, living standards have been declining since the 1980s. So being able to use China as a way of shaming our own ruling class and saying, Well, take for example, there's a very simple question that I always ask. I say, well, take all of these politicians who have been accused of corruption, right? I'm not going to mention them simply because what I'm about to say may be quite provocative. The question we can ask is, how would they be punished in China for their corruption? Now, bear in mind that in China, if you graft sums above $400,000, you're liable for the death penalty. It's very extreme. Now, I'm not advocating the death penalty. What I'm saying is that this shows something about the class character of their country. Now, why not raise that and say, this is why China can actually shine some light on how we can rebuild our own system. So I think these are the kind of narratives that we should be putting forward if we want to build, a new democracy.
Yeah, it's very telling when you have a conversation with any Australian, and most often than not, they will agree with any kind of opinion that is distrustful of corporate billionaires and corporate greed and how unethical Corporations Act and all that kind of stuff. And so when you put the scenario to them that we should deal with them this way, and then you in that way you say, okay, this is how you put forward in terms of how China will deal with it, without mentioning China, mind you, they're all on board with it. Australians are all on board with how China treats its political class when they're found of corruption, and how it treats their corporate class when they're guilty of acting against the public interest. So it's very telling that the Australian government and the media want to direct as much scorn towards China as possible, when in reality, when you take the word China out of it, but you just focus on the actual policies that they have, Australians are by and large in agreement with them.
Can I just, before we move on, hang on, sorry, just move on. Look, welcome, Nada. So Nada was having some internet problems and couldn't log in earlier, and that internet was down. But look, welcome aboard. We're sort of well into this now, but look, feel free to contribute on the discussion as well.
Hey, thank you. Sorry, I'm late.
That's okay. Yeah, that's perfect. Okay.
Yeah, I was going to say just before it's also a country where China, where there's also at the moment there has been for the last couple of years. There's a big debate about what democracy, people's democracy means, and how do we go about it. So that's a key political question there at the moment. It's not only the government. And by the way, I just should mention that I think it's about the only place that I know of where members of parliament are actually not paid a wage. They're paid a little bit. They actually keep their old jobs. They have to actually work for a living in a normal job unless they're a minister. Obviously, then it becomes unworkable. And that happens at the national, regional, and local level. So there's also powers, particularly at the local level, for recall and so on. And there's an electoral process that people deny here. We don't hear about that does exist there. But our main turf is here. And I just want to mention again, just briefly, with the internet and the platforms. I agree with what Jay and Nate has said. But there's another dimension to why the Australian government's acting the way it is. And I'd say in the UK and US the same way. And that they're very closely tied to Rupert Murdoch and his organisation. And there is a battle at the moment going on. Murdoch has particularly targeted Facebook and Google, and not to actually make it accessible and more democratic, but actually to control it and do the opposite. So this push towards turning them into publishers comes from Murdoch. It was Murdoch's demand on the Australian government. So we need to recognise that's why this other media is also important. But also, what you said before, Dave, you're talking about taking demands, which we need to do. We need to take demands to government and to other areas as a movement or series of movements. But appealing and taking demands in the current period in Australian history is becoming less and less effective. Right? We're finding this out. The problem is, and you look at the union movement that has been doing that, one of its problems is, the government says, no, and then they water down their demand, and over time they're actually moving backwards. We've seen that with industrial relations law. We need to, as a series of movements, as a movement of the Australian people, start working out how we don't just demand certain things, but we start the discussion and start going out about the business of actually saying, right, this is what we want. We need to find ways of implementing it, not waiting for the current lot of politicians, judges, and senior bureaucrats to do the right thing by us. We know they're not going to. We always know that. Even if they do, what happens? What has been our experience? They'll make a concession today, take it away tomorrow. So we need to start saying, right, we need to build a movement, not a movement that begs and asks for, please, I want more, the Oliver Twist thing. We need to build a movement that actually enforces it.
Yeah, I only caught the end of it, so I'm just kind of catching on to what the conversation is. But as far as what you said, Joe, I do agree. I think that we're kind of used to in Australia kind of having this kind of relationship with Parliament where it is sort of like I mean, it wasn't always like this. Obviously, like the militancy of the union movement is what really secured a lot of the democratic rights and economic um, you know, uh, equity or whatever that we've gotten in the past. But I do think that we have a sort of like over reliance on these sort of institutions, particularly the kind of like labor financial institutions, financial, sorry. And it kind of, I think we do kind of, and at least the past few decades from my understanding of labor history is that we're just sort of like in a defensive position, constantly just like, no, don't don't undo our progress or whatever, and we have no way to like positively assert anything new. And I think part of that just does come down to like a failure of a bit of a failure of imagination as well, in terms of how we can do that, and new forms of organizing, etc. Because as the unions have become more and more intertwined with the state, particularly like especially since the Hawke Keating governments, where they've been professionalized and really institutionalized. I mean, they've always been connected with the Labour Party, but as the Labour Party has become more and more disconnected from its working class base and has become more a tool of social managerialism, we've come into the situation where the vast majority of Australians are not unionized anymore. So where does our power come from? How do we like, because this is something that we like, Australia's democratic history has always been tied up with our working class history, obviously, and the working class struggle. So we're left in this new paradigm where we don't really know how to assert ourselves, and you can even see it with sort of impotency of the sort of right wing populists. I sympathise with a lot of the impulses of them, especially when like the government is being obviously corrupt and obviously overstepping its bounds. So I kind of understand the impulse, but what are they actually going to achieve, and what are they actually going to do to like? They don't really have much of a means to it. It just all goes into the hands of these politicians. So I do think that's like part of what we have to do here, especially as a think tank, as Australians for New Democracy, is to really interrogate what are these new forms of organizations and new forms of political innovations that we should be pursuing. And yeah, I don't know. It's an open question. And I think we have a lot of good examples overseas to look at least for inspiration. We can't copy them, obviously. I think it was Jay was talking earlier about what we can learn from China, and I agree. But obviously, any kind of socialism or new democracy, it's not going to be Chinese. It's going to be Australian. If it's going to have socialism in Australia, it's going to have Australian characteristics, not Chinese characteristics. And that includes everything in terms of democracy as well. So we should also look into our own history in terms of and our own like independent like I've been looking into a lot our our kind of traditions of like local independent government and council, and look into the idea of like empowering councils to be more strong compared to the state governments, and to look at perhaps using those as a basis, as well as obviously workplace organizing, but to empower council governments as well. But yeah, that's just an assortment of thoughts. I'll kind of let you guys go on from there.
I'll jump in there because I'm also wary of time now. But look, I've also taken account. Yes, we need to. That's been said. We should look at other experiences of other countries. I mean, obviously, there's no actual blueprint that we have to abide by. But we can look at countries like Venezuela, Nicaragua, as well, who are actually going, even though with the difficulties they're facing at times, are obviously going miles ahead. We can all look at different models and different ways of going about things. There's no one size fits all. This is how it works. And I also wanted to comment on Luke just been mentioned about you guys starting a party or something. No, we're not starting a party. There's plenty of parties out there at the moment. We are more of we're an educational think tank, etc. We're into actually getting out from the movement into the masses, and that's what we do to educate and help empower people to organise themselves through community assemblies, unions, whatever, organisations. And that as well. The party doesn't come first. It's usually what's born out of the struggle. But there's 1 parties out there at the moment. And I'm not going to mention names, but obviously if they're not riding any way forward. And what I actually wanted to play through, and correct me if I'm wrong, comrades, but we'll probably need to summarise in that. But obviously with the website, we've got at least there's 3 demands up there that we want a decent standard of living and quality of life for everyone. And we obviously for sovereignty, political, economic, and cultural power, especially in the hands of Australian people or in the hands of the Australian people and especially the First Nations, and peace and no war. Peace, no war, and unity with the nations of the world. We want to have a peaceful foreign policy where win-win cooperation is our presence with many other countries, not this being on the part of a US satellite nation, the lapdog of US imperialism, and be on a war footing all the time. But most importantly as well, and I'll throw this in, exactly what the comrades in the US have been demanding also is a government of action that fights for working families. And we've never had that for a very, very long time. We should be putting that to all politicians, that we want a government of action that fights for working families and putting these other points forward. We want a vision for Australia where we're building a new Australia, and obviously, and one that everyone can participate and feel part of, instead of being this divisive, where everyone's against each other, and where wealth's being concentrated in fewer hands while everyone else is economically worse off. So that's certainly a vision we have to strive for. And how it's going to go about it, well, obviously we put some demands in place, and we can and how we need to develop a strategy around it. That's going to be also the fundamental question. Comrades, did you want to say any last things before we finish up?
Well, there was like...
sorry,
Jay. Me? Yeah, I mean, there was a comment that popped up before everyone saw it. It was by Ben Franklin. He said, "Those silently consenting to mandates are against freedom." I actually agree. I mean, I know this is a huge topic. I mean, we can't really cover it like in the next... I don't know do we have like another half an hour to go, or are we going to be wrapping up soon? Or
well, look, comrades, if we want to, I know because it's such a huge subject, we could be up here for the next. I don't want to go all too long, but look, if you're prepared,
I'd like to put it on record that I'm against the mandates. So that's like my own personal opinion. I think that if you look at the way that Pfizer's behaved, I mean, their unwillingness to even release the trial data until 24 months after the study, and initially they wanted to lock away that data for 75 years. I mean, what's going on there? There's also the myocarditis problem that comes with the Pfizer vaccine, and there's also the problem that we don't have vaccine choice. I mean, here in Australia, it's like Pfizer versus AstraZeneca. I mean, we can't have the Russian or the Chinese vaccine for geopolitical reasons. And we don't really have a traditional vaccine option as far as I know. So yeah, I mean, these are for these reasons. I think it's legitimate to say that you should not. Yeah, it should not be mandated.
Yeah, I think
My
a
own
lot of
view,
the
not speaking for anyone else, but yeah, go ahead.
yeah, I think a lot of the anxieties out there for people who are against the mandates, it is mainly centered around the fact that you just brought up, Jay, is that Australians by and large don't trust corporate institutions or government institutions, right? And that's because they've had generational experiences that has resulted in these institutions betraying them, right? Materially, right? They've seen their living standards decrease decade on decade. They've seen these institutions fail to provide any kind of standard of living for them. And so now, when a pandemic rears its ugly head, these institutions are telling us that we must do this. And of course, the reaction is going to be, no, we won't. And so the problem is there is that we don't have that trust, and we can't blame them for not having that trust. I think that is absolutely critical to acknowledge here. Is that you can say all kinds of fluffy sounding ideological things and say, oh no, you should believe this, or you should believe that, or you should take the vax, or you should not take the vax, or whatever. But that's not really here nor there, because when you're talking about what is actually true concretely, is that the trust is not there, and that's not their fault that the trust isn't there. That's not these people's fault. The fault is of the government and the industry owners of this country who have for generations thrown the Australian people under the rug. So that's the point that I want to try and get across there. I'm sure that's what you're sort of leaning on as well, Jay. That sort of material root of that distrust, and that's what we have to focus on. It's not about being pro-vax or anti-vax, right? Because a lot of these people who are against the mandates are actually for some kind of a vaccine, right? They do believe in vaccines to some capacity, just ideally, right? So I don't think that's the actual issue, because when I go to some of these people and I say to them, look, would you trust a vaccine more if it was developed by Australians for Australians by an Australian institution that is checked by a panel of the Australian public that is elected by the people? And they say yes, they would, right? And if you have these conversations with these people, right, you can start to humanize these people more than just being anti-vaxxers, right? And that's what we need to get towards. We need to get towards a humanization of our Australian brothers and sisters again, so that we can stop this culture war bullshit that's being artificially sustained and created by the media, that keeps us divided against each other, so that prevents us from actually moving forward to some kind of new democracy.
Yeah, I think I don't want to add to that, except to say that one of the reasons for distrust, one of the other reasons I should say, is the slow creep of Big Brother. They're becoming more intrusive. Our rights are being diminished, and these people are saying that, and they're right when they say that. Now, the slogan that Dave brought, for a government of action for working families, I think it's a fantastic slogan, and I would recommend it be popularized everywhere, because I think it sums up. It's not that we're going there begging, please do the nice thing. We're saying that's what we want. And if we have Australia saying that's what they want, then that will put enormous pressure on, but also help to build a movement. Now, just want to finish off, since Dave also mentioned it. In the last 2 years, I've traveled around Venezuela twice. And there is something we can't copy like anywhere else, because they've got their own situation. But really, the political battle is not about who's going to be the president. It's about whether the beginnings of what they call the Comuna movement or the commune movement is going to rise, or it's going to be stopped. And certainly the United States and those who are allied to it want to stop it. Now, from personal accounts, as eyewitness accounts, I've traveled through various parts of the country, talking to communities, talking to all sorts of people, and what they're doing is precisely what was mentioned before. They've said, we're not waiting for things to be jobs, livelihoods to be provided. We're not waiting for democracy to be provided. We're making it ourselves. And communities are getting together. They've set their communes, which do all sorts of things from whether they collect or supervise, from garbage collection to fixing up the roads to providing schools and kinders for their kids, right across the board to providing also industries, workplaces that manufacture stuff that their community needs, but also that other communities need. In the countryside, people who work on the land are working the land together collectively, and they find their, and also sustainably. That's been a huge change there. One of the big changes there has been in a Latin American country, a part of the world that's known for its machismo, the bloke runs everything, right? There's been a huge move on the ground to actually bring equality for women. And a lot of the leadership, in actual fact, on the stats, almost 65% of the leadership at the national, regional, and local level are women. And it's changing the outlook of men in a big way. Although some of the women said, we still got a battle at home because we're still expected to do the cook and the housework, and feed the kids. But that's a battle still going on. We're all familiar with it. But this sense of equality, the sense that we are the power, we are building our power together, which is more important than who is president. And that's something that we can learn from.
I agree. I do think it's twofold. Because on the one hand, I think that our power does have to come like grassroots from the bottom up. But at the same time, we also there is a sort of necessity for real national leadership, a real a president, I would say. And this is also ties to the question of the republic. And I don't know if you guys discussed this yet or not, because I was not here. But the different sort of models of republic, and how there's the two competing visions are that the parliament's just electing the president themselves, or if it's a directly popular voted president. And I think that, and there's a reason why the both of the major parties are really not for the second option, and why they constantly fearmonger. Especially, I was reading this article by former Prime Minister Keating about how there's so much of a danger of this because you could have a Trump. You don't know. It's like too scary, and it's like, I think they would prefer it if we kind of kept to a more of a passive role. We just elect the parliament and we let them do it. But I think that there is something very necessary about having some kind of to have the importance of the sovereign, of having an Australian head of state, and having that have a direct popular mandate. I think that's something that we have to also look, as well as the more localistic participatory democracy. There's also a need for good and strong popular leadership, which we don't have in the parliamentarian system. So that's also something to consider as well. It's like twofold. There's both a local side and a central side that we should consider when it comes to a new democracy in Australia.
Yeah, man, I think so. Well, I'm going to do something about this, but yeah, look, to answer all that question, I think, even myself, we weren't even pro-mandate ourselves, and there was obviously, I'm not going to keep repeating on what was already said, but it's pretty much that clearly actually made it all, but it was a completely distrust of basically corporations and governments after being lied to many years. There's actually a good little story. Once, I remember when I was a kid, was about the boy who cries wolf. And I think it certainly did apply to the current situation as well. Even if it was okay for us, the reality is at the end of the day, how it's very hard to believe. Well, I'm going to have to. I think we can have obviously wind this up unless there's anything I completely missed, comrades. I think we've pretty much covered it all today. I think it's such a big topic. Look, Well, once again, for all the participants tonight, Jay, Nada, and Joe, Helen's watching attentively as well, so thank you once again. This was supposed to actually go broadcast by the Australian New Democracy YouTube channel. We had issues trying to connect it up with the stream ID we were using, so we're trying to sort that out, but we will download it and have that uploaded there. But the URL is below for the website, and obviously on Facebook it actually comes under Community Assembly, so I recommend go to that, like it, share it far and wide, invite other people as well. We will be doing a lot more of these lives further on, and also pre-recorded educations as well. And also a big thank you to all the viewers that came in. Big shout out to Enoch, but also to Luke McMaster as well. And obviously those are overseas, like We Need Critical Thinking, and Ben as well. Look, thank you, and also thank you to future viewers who are watching this, and also I'd like to acknowledge the Centre of Political Innovation in the US and Caleb Morpin and many of the other good comrades who've actually pretty much was the inspiration behind this to kick it off. That and Caleb has gave me the big thumbs up. Good on you, and for kicking this off. And I think this is something it's uniquely for us. I know we had that discussion of what we were going to call it Centre of Political Innovation, but we wanted actually a little bit more identifiable of what works for us here in Australia as well. And obviously that's the unique about the struggle. Our struggles, there might be some interesting parallels, but we actually develop our own way forward. So that's pretty much comes to it tonight. Look, and once again, thank you to all the panel discussion tonight, and also too thank you for everybody else on your support. And once again, to summarise that, we definitely need a government of action that fights for working families. And wish you all the best for the rest of the day. And just one more announcement. Tomorrow night we are resuming We Are the Builders Australia, first study of the year, and I believe, Joe, we're studying males on a new democracy. And so that will tune in. That'll be at 7 o'clock, and 7 o'clock Australian Eastern Daylight Time. And I do apologise for anyone in Western Australia. I know that because of daylight time, you are actually currently 3 hours behind. But look, if you can tune in. All right, well, I'll finish it off there, and thank you very much.
Okay, see you.
All the best.
See you guys.
Bye bye.